Both of these code customizations have been built with version 6.2. So we'll go ahead and discuss both of them in detail. Let's get started on our code customization for Audit Trail. And what we're going to do at this point in time is discuss many different ways of how we can accomplish leaving an audit trail in our database. And what is an audit trail? At the end of the day, what we want to do is basically track who and when, who updated the record and when the record was actually updated. So in order to do that, what we want to do basically is keep track of essentially the date and time and the user at the time of inserting the data, when the data is first, actually when a record is first created. The second thing that we want to do is we want to essentially, whenever a record is being updated, we want to effectively use and store the last updated date user, date and time, as well as the user who actually last updated it. Obviously, Audit Trail can get even more complex, like we can actually create a journal, you can create a log, and you can create a copy of the previous data, and so on. And we are not going to cover that in this particular example, but of course, you can certainly do that with RNSP Designer as well. There are many different ways of accomplishing this particular code customization, and each one of them has its own advantages and disadvantages. I can tell you at least 3 different ways today, basically, of how to do that. The first approach is based on essentially the user interface, and it'll require using of hidden fields on the web page. This approach is very easy to do. It can be completely done in RNSP Designer. You don't have to go outside and do any code customization or anything like that. But unfortunately, the downside of this particular approach is that it has to be done on many pages. And then sometimes it may leave a blank space on the page, for example. But certainly, it has its own advantages and disadvantages. We'll go over this example as well. The second is to actually write some code and make some user interface code customization. This certainly has more flexibility than hidden fields because it allows you to do many other things, basically, that you may not be able to do just with the RNSP Designer user interface. But then, of course, it still also has the same disadvantage as the hidden fields because it has to be done on many different pages, on every page that contains the add or edit data. The next thing that we can do also is do this code customization at the data access layer. The advantage of doing it at the data access layer is you have to do it once, and it applies for all, for the entire application, for all of the web pages that you have in your application. So anytime there is an add or an edit that is being done, the data access layer will be called just before, your code customizations will be called just before the data is updated in the database. So this way, you only have to make this code customization once and never have to do it again. The only disadvantage of this thing is that in some cases, it may require passing of the data to the data access layer. Data access layer generally does not have access to the user interface data, for example. So you may have to essentially, so if you want to use some of the data from the page itself as an example, then you'll have to figure out some mechanism in order to pass that. And generally that is done through a session. But there is a little bit extra work if you want to do that. So each one of these approaches have their benefits, and each one of these have their disadvantages. So let's go through and talk about how we will do that. But before we do that, let's just make sure that we know how our database schema looks like. Here is an example employee table. An employee table contains all of the information about an employee. This is from the Southwind database that is included with your copy of RNSP Designer. And in this particular case, we have all of the employee information like last name, first name, and so on. But in addition to that, we have added 4 additional fields. These are called the audit fields. They are created on, created by, last updated on, and last updated by. This is a Microsoft Access example in this particular case, and these 4 fields have been added to the employee database. So let's go through and talk about the first code customization, which is how to use the hidden fields. What is our strategy in doing this thing? The strategy in doing this is to add audit trail fields to the page if they are not already there. Most of the time they'll already be there, and we don't have to worry about that. On the page properties, the next thing that we need to do is make certain changes to the to the properties of each one of these controls. What we need to do is essentially either mark them as visible or invisible based on based on what we want to do, and then we want to set the initial value for these to essentially use the created date or current date or the current logged in user. And fields are initialized when page is displayed. So just a minor point over here, if somebody displays a page and then goes off, gets a coffee, and comes back, the initial time is essentially going to be when they initially loaded the page, not when they press the save button. So a minor thing to keep in mind there. In this approach, there are no changes that are necessary on the code side. So you don't have to worry about VB.NET or C#. You just essentially make these code customizations directly in the IronSpeed Designer user interface. Let's see how we can do that. I have this presentation for you that is available for you to download after this webinar. So what I will do is actually I'll switch over to IronSpeed Designer and actually do that within Designer rather than going through the presentation over here. So let me bring up IronSpeed Designer. Here is an Add Employees page that normally gets generated. It's got all of the fields that you can imagine, last name, first name, title, and so on. And then you've got a notes area in the middle here, and then followed by a created by, last updated by, and other fields that are displayed over here. So what we want to do effectively is switch over to the design mode. And when we switch over to the design mode, you will see that there are different areas of the page that you can zoom in and zoom out. So if we zoom in to the employee fields area, for example, what we will see is that all of the fields that are displayed for you, including, for example, the created on field, the last updated on, the created by, and the last updated by. So for whatever reason, the organization of this was done in this particular way, and that's okay. We can, if we want, we can move it. But if these fields were not available, you can go to the fields. You can go to the Fields tab of the toolbox and accomplish the same thing by simply, for example, taking some of these fields like created by and then dragging and dropping over here. So that way you'll have those fields on the particular page. I'm simply going to undo this thing and just use the fields that are already there. The next order of business for us is to do two things. Let's take this created on field, and what we want to do is, first of all, this is today a text box because it's on the control type. It is displayed as a text box because we are essentially asking the user to enter the created on date. But in this particular case, because it's an audit trail field, what we want to do is we want to change this to a literal so that the user is not allowed to modify this data. We can go to the Display tab, and we can, if we want, make this invisible. If we don't, we can leave it on there, and what it'll do is it'll show the current date and time to the user so that the user knows exactly what it is. But if I wanted to, I can uncheck this visible flag and hide it effectively. Let me, for the purpose of this demo, you leave this as visible. There's a third thing that I need to do that is very important in order for this to work. Normally, labels and literal are not saved in the database, and they're not saved as a matter of efficiency because presumably, since it's a label or literal, user cannot modify it, so we are not going to essentially retrieve that field or retrieve that value and save it into the database. What we need to do is tell IronSpeed Designer to generate code so that that value is being retrieved from the user interface and is going to be saved in the database. And to do that, we are going to essentially select a save field value to database. This is not required for a text box because IronSpeed Designer automatically assumes that if it's a text box or a checkbox or a radio button, you want to save the data. But for a label and literal, we basically say, you know what, why don't we effectively allow you to, so you check here, and then the data will be saved. So these are the three changes that you need to make for each one of the other fields. Now what I can do is I can go through and then do the same set of changes on the last updated on field and go through, change that to a literal, and go to save field in database. Actually, there's one other thing that we need to do on the created on that I forgot. On the created on, what we need to do is we need to set the initial value. What is the initial value on created on? In the case of created on, we want to essentially initialize it to current date and time. So if you look at the initial value tab, it gives you a set of choices that are available, including a custom function option. The logged-in user ID is grayed out unless and until you have security turned on in your application. If you have security turned on, the logged-in user ID will be enabled. In the case of the created on field, what we want to do is set it to current date and time, and we'll go ahead and then switch on to the last updated on. In the case of last updated on, we actually do not want this field on this particular add page. We probably only want it on the edit page. But just for the purpose of this argument, I'm still going to go ahead and initialize this to current date and time. Make sure that it's still visible and saved here, and it is set to literal. The last two fields that I have is created by, and same thing, I'm going to change this to literal. I'm going to go ahead and change the display to make sure that it is saved to the database. But also, I have an option of specifying an initial value. Now, in this particular case, like I mentioned to you, I've not turned on security in this application, so logged in user ID is grayed out. But I can also use and show you how to use a custom function. The custom function is nothing but any function that is available to you from inside of IronSpeed Designer, and you can simply go ahead and type that function name directly. Generally, that function has to be a shared function so that it is accessible across all of your applications. And what you can do basically is type something like, for example, in this case, this is a Visual Basic.NET application, so I'm going to use me.page.systemutils. Systemutils is a utility class that is available in your base classes, and it has a whole bunch of functions, and in this case, the one that I'm going to use and get login ID. So all I have to do is I have to essentially type in, and if you go and press the question mark over here, you will be taken to the IronSpeed Designer online help, which gives you a whole bunch of examples of what are the different custom functions that you can use here. I'm going to go ahead and change this back to none because I don't have a get login ID in this particular case. And I'll go ahead and do the same thing with last updated by, change this to literal, mark it as save, and then go ahead and press OK on this. So now if I switch back to live preview, what you will notice is that the created on field and the last updated on field after it is rebuilt are display only fields, and they are not, they're going to display the current time when the page is actually displayed. Okay, so that is the first part of the code customization. So you can see it's 1/21/2010, and the same thing with last updated on. Now, in this particular case, the time is not being displayed, even though I selected current date and time. And the reason it is not being displayed is because my display format does not allow that to happen. So if I wanted, I can go back to design mode, double-click on created on, and I can go to the display format and add a time. And even if I wanted to include seconds, for example, I can include that and go ahead and do that. Okay, so this is how you can do the first mechanism, which is essentially use hidden fields or use fields on a page to accomplish your audit trail. The next way that you can do that, and I'm going to switch over to our presentation here. So now you can see the 8:15 a.m. that is being displayed here. Oops. Okay, so what I'm going to do is switch over to the second approach, basically. And the second approach is to use code customization. This is a similar approach as the first approach because it's done at the page level, but you don't have to display these fields to the user. And you have a little bit more flexibility in the sense that you can actually initialize the value to any thing that you can do in code, as an example. So you can call any different function. You can retrieve the value from URL parameter, you can retrieve a session, or anything like that. And this allows you to effectively have that flexibility in order to do that. In order to do this, you will be customizing what is called the getUIData function. The getUIData function is a function that is implemented as a record control, and it retrieves all of the user interface data just before the data is actually saved into the database. So what we want to do is override this getUIData function, and we want to essentially do our own code customization as part of that. Now, again, I have all of this documented in the presentation, but I'll go ahead and switch over and do this in IronSpeed Designer. So the first and foremost thing is I will switch back to the design mode over here, and what I want to do is through my here, what I want to do is go all the way to the top level of the page. So the top level of the page is right underneath the master page. It's the add employees.aspx. And if I click there, what I'm seeing essentially is a zoomed out view of that page in the spreadsheet grid. So in the zoomed out view, I only see the top level components effectively on the page. The first top level component is the employees record control. The second is the orders table control, which is the child table, and then any page buttons that go through that are available on that page. Now, if you look at the employees record control and switch over to the bottom over here, you've got the cell editor, and then you've got a whole bunch of other functions that are available for you that can be customized at the employees record control. And one of those functions is get UI data. So if you notice over here, I have get UI data, and the actual code that is generated by our InSuite Designer is displayed for you over here. Now, this particular get UI data, if you want to read through the code over here, retrieves effectively all of the data from the user interface, including the address, birth date, and so on and so forth, for example, right? What we can do is essentially, instead of doing it this way, we can effectively gut this function out completely and replace it with essentially our own code by first calling the base get UI data. So this is always a good thing to do, which is always call the base function and make sure that it is available for you at this point in time so that you don't have to essentially do all of the work that was being already done for you. Now, you could, if you wanted to leave the original code as is effectively and then add to it. That's also a possibility if you wanted to do that. The next thing that you can do is you can basically then say me.dataSource, and me.dataSource refers to, in this particular case, the employee's record. So this is the data source that is going to be saved into the database. So if I can update essentially any of the fields on the data source variable, so I can basically say created on equal to, and then I can just say datetime.now, for example. And I can repeat this process for the other one, last updated on equal datetime now, and then I can certainly do other fields like me.data source dot last updated on created by, and then I can effectively do and then I could of course initialize this to the me.page.systemutils.get login ID if I wanted to, but certainly I can do any other things that I wanted to here. So here is an example of how I can set all of these fields up, and then when I switch over to live preview, this function will be, changes that I made will be compiled, and if I did not make any mistakes in my typing, hopefully it'll compile and will actually be able to work. So in this particular case, we are effectively going to, let's say for example, I add and I'll go ahead and press save. Now keep in mind that this was already initialized here, but we will see if the created by and the last updated by are saved appropriately. I believe these are string fields, so hopefully I will not get an error in this case. Let me just see. Okay, looks like it did. If I go back, and you can see last updated by and created by being displayed appropriately. So that's the second method, and the second method uses essentially a mechanism where you can do some code customization inside of your user interface layer in order to accomplish this thing. Let's switch over to the third approach basically here. And the third approach is probably the most general approach that we would recommend that you use, but it requires some amount of code customization. So this one is a data access layer code customization, and it is done essentially at the data access layer so that it is available to all places where this particular data is being added or updated. In the data access layer, there are a number of events that are sent just prior to the data being actually saved in the database. And these events are inserting record, updating record, deleting record, and then also they are a post update events that are available as well, like inserted record, updated record, and deleted record. And these events are raised either just before or just after, and they are raised whether you're using inline SQL or stored procedures. So either way, it doesn't really matter. Your code customization will look exactly the same way as well. Now, in this particular case, what you have to do is do it at the level of each table. So that, let's say you have an employees table and a customers table and an orders table, you would effectively implement this code customization at each one of those three table levels. And it is generally done in a file which starts out with the name of your table. Like if you have employees, it would be employeesrecord.vb or employeesrecord.cs. And this is generally contained in the My App on your application's app code business layer folder in there. And then this code can be added in the record class, and changes that you make in this particular class, keep in mind, will never be overwritten. They're always safe. So this is equivalent to essentially your section 1 on your page. And this class derives from a base class, which is the generated code. So you don't have to worry about the generated code at this point in time. You simply override this top-level class, and that's what will allow you to accomplish this thing. Now, how does this code look like? This code looks like the following, basically. So all you have to do is essentially write a function, like in this case, we'll call this audit insert, and we will effectively handle what is called the .inserting record event. And in this particular case, what we can do is initialize any of the fields like created on, created by simply essentially assigning a value to them. Now, in some cases, I may want to essentially retrieve those values from the session. So this way, that's the reason why I've effectively, because I don't have access to the user interface when I'm on the data access layer. The reason for that is the data access layer is common to all web pages. So we don't know where you came from, whether you came from the Add Employees page or the Edit Employees page or any other page, for example, where an employee is being added, or it could even be programmatically added, for example. In all of those cases, the data access layer will get fired, and we don't know essentially where it is coming from, so that's the reason why you do not have access to the user interface effectively. And it's also not good practice to access user interface at the data access layer at the lower level over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste this code, but first let me switch over to IronSpeed Designer and show you where to put this thing in there. Notice that what you've got is a presentation layer in your Application Explorer and a business layer. So if I open up my business layer, open up the employees, I have the employees record file that is given here in the Application Explorer. If I double-click that, or if I click that, I am going to see an empty file effectively, which derives from the base employees record. The base employees record file is not displayed initially, but if I wanted to, I can go through and select display all source files, in which case you will now see not only the employees record, but also the base employees record, which is the generated code. So if I wanted to look at the generated code, I can see that. But in this case, I want to go ahead and look at the employees record. This is where I can insert my all of the audit functions here. So let me go ahead and copy that from this Word document, which you also have access to here, but it saves me from typing all of that code. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and copy both of these functions, and I'll explain this to you in a minute here. So if you notice these two functions over here, what they do is the first one is called audit insert. We could have given it any name, but the parameters are going to be the same. And then there is a handle event. Now, C# is slightly different because you cannot essentially do the handles keyword effectively. But nevertheless, what you can effectively do here is handle this inserting record event. And in this, because we are actually on the employee's record itself, me refers to the record that is being saved. Or in the case of C#, it will be this. So I have access to all of the fields like created on, first name, last name, and so on. And what I can do is essentially just set the values here, and I am done. So this way, what it allows me to do is just before the data is being inserted into the database, I can get called, and I can do my updates at this point in time. The same thing can be done at the audit, at the update level as well, which allows me to essentially update in these cases. Excuse me. It updates the last updated on and the last updated by fields here. Okay, so I think this is basically it for the data access layer code customization. I will now go ahead and take any questions that you might have. So these are we talked about the 3 different ways that you can accomplish this thing. And we will go ahead and talk mainly at this point in time about the data, about the audit trail. And then I can take other general questions later on after the second code customization example.